Thank you all for joining today's call. While we wait for more folks to join today's session, please share your name, pronouns, and the land that you're calling from into the chat box.
Gracias por acompañarnos el día de hoy. Por favor, mientras esperamos a que las personas se unan, por favor, compartan su nombre y pronombre y la tierra en la cual viven en el chat. Gracias.
Thank you to everyone who's just joining today's call. If you just joined, please feel free to share your name, your pronouns, and the land that you're calling in from into the chat box.
Gracias a quienes nos acompañan hoy. Si se acaban de unir, si pueden poner en el chat, por favor, sus nombres, pronombres y el nombre de la tierra en donde se encuentran.
Thank you all for joining the fourth Toxic Money training series organized by Stop the Money Pipeline, Action Center on Race and the Economy, Americans for Financial Reform Education Fund, Public Citizen, Positive Money, Amazon Watch, and the Sunrise Project. Before we dive into today's presentation, I'd like to briefly turn it over to Aki Chatterjee, who is the digital campaigner of Positive Money US, who will introduce us to language justice.
Thank you, Moon-Young. Welcome, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us this evening. I'm Aki Chatterjee. I use she, her pronouns, and I'm a campaigner with Positive Money US. I'm here with Alexia and Leah, who are interpreting into Spanish, and Trisha and Valerie, who are interpreting into ASL, and with Trish and Isela, who are doing card captioning in English and Spanish, respectively.
Bienvenidos a todos. Muchas gracias por estar aquí con nosotros esta tarde. Soy Aki Chatterjee, uso pronombre ella y trabajo en campañas con Positive Money US. Estoy aquí con Alexia y Leah, que están interpretando al español, y Trisha y Valerie, que están interpretando la lengua de señas norteamericana, y con Trish y Isela, que están haciendo subtítulos en vivo en inglés y español respectivamente.
To access captions in English or Spanish, click on the links you will find in the chat. And a note, this session is being recorded.
Para acceder a los subtítulos en inglés o español, haga clic en los enlaces que se encuentran en el chat. Y un aviso, esta sesión está siendo grabada.
The Language Justice team is here today working within a framework called Language Justice. Language justice includes a commitment to everyone's full presence and capacity to communicate in our languages. We acknowledge all the languages here today, and especially the languages of the Indigenous people of this land.
El equipo de justicia del lenguaje está aquí hoy trabajando con un marco que se llama la justicia del lenguaje. La justicia del lenguaje incluye el compromiso de la presencia plena de todos y la capacidad de comunicarnos en nuestros idiomas. Reconocemos todos los idiomas presentes hoy aquí y en particular los idiomas de los pueblos indígenas de esta tierra.
In general, in a language justice framework, we use more than one language actively. And in the future, we hope to organize these conversations in that way. For today, folks will be speaking in English with interpreting into Spanish and ASL. So if you prefer to listen in Spanish, you will be able to select the Spanish channel in a couple of minutes.
En general, con la justicia del lenguaje se usa más de un idioma activamente. Y en el futuro esperamos organizar estas conversaciones así. Para hoy, los presentadores hablarán en inglés con interpretación a la lengua de señas norteamericana y al español. Así que si usted prefiere escuchar en español, podrá elegir el canal de español en unos pocos minutos.
We'll be using the Zoom interpreting function, which is already activated. If you're joining from a computer, you will see a globe icon on the bottom of your screen. If you're joining from a tablet or phone, click on More, and you will see a menu that will include an option called Language Interpretation. If you can't see the globe or the language interpretation option, contact Aki to get help, me. To listen to the interpreting, click the globe icon or language interpretation, then choose your language channel. If you are using a tablet or phone, make sure to click on Done once you choose your language. Now we're going to do a quick test of the interpreting function, and Leah will finish this announcement so I can be available for tech support.
Usaremos aquí la función de interpretación de Zoom que ya está activada. Si usted se está conectando con su computadora, verá un icono de un mundo en la parte inferior de la pantalla. Si usted se está conectando con su tableta o teléfono, pulse en Más y verá un menú que incluye la opción de interpretación de idiomas. Si no puede ver el mundo o la opción de interpretación de idiomas, después de que se haya activado la función, pues ya está activada. Si no lo ven, entonces por favor pónganse en contacto con Aki para recibir ayuda. Para escuchar la interpretación, pulse el icono del mundo donde dice Interpretation o en el menú Interpretación de idiomas. A continuación, elija su canal preferido de idioma. Y si usted está usando una tableta o teléfono, asegúrese de hacer clic en Finalizar o Done después de escoger su idioma. Ahora vamos a hacer una breve prueba de la función de interpretación. Entonces, I am now speaking in English, and people on the Spanish channel should be able to hear Alexia speaking in Spanish. Y ahora estoy hablando en inglés y deben de escuchar a Alexia en el canal de inglés. Perdón, estoy hablando español y deben de escuchar a Alexia en el canal de inglés. Bueno, usaremos interpretación simultánea para el resto de este anuncio muy breve. Ahora, todas las personas que prefieren participar en un solo idioma deben estar en un canal de idioma. Las personas que hablan ambos idiomas, inglés y español, pueden dejar la función de interpretación apagada o pueden elegir un canal. Puede pulsar en silenciar audio original para escuchar solamente a la intérprete. Y si no puede escuchar la intérprete, por favor no sufra en silencio. Use la caja de chat para pedir ayuda. Y con el objetivo de equidad de lenguaje, vamos a limitar el uso del chat a necesidades tecnológicas y preguntas. Si tiene una pregunta para los presentadores, por favor, escríbala en el chat en español o inglés. Nos comprometemos a responder a todas las preguntas con los recursos que mandamos. Vamos a mandar las respuestas a las preguntas junto con los recursos después del evento. Las personas que entienden español habrán notado que usamos la terminación E en vez de la tradicional A u O. Por ejemplo, cuando decimos bienvenides, no es un error de pronunciación, sino un esfuerzo intencional de crear espacios inclusivos y evitar hacer presunciones con relación al género. Gracias a STMP, incluyendo las organizaciones asociadas, Action Center on Race and the Economy, Positive Money US, Public Citizen, Americans for Financial Reform Education Fund y The Sunrise Project, por hacer posible que estemos aquí. Nos da mucho gusto poder apoyar este espacio multilingüe, ya que sentimos una fuerte solidaridad con el trabajo que hacen. Y ahora el evento puede comenzar oficialmente. Muchísimas gracias.
Thank you so much to the Language Justice team and to Aki. Hi, everyone. My name is Moon-Young Ko. I use she, her pronouns, and I am the Climate Finance Campaign Manager at Americans for Financial Reform Education Fund, which is located on occupied Piscataway land, also known as Washington, D.C. I am pleased to moderate today's discussion on protecting your savings, our communities, and the planet. Today, we'll be hearing from 3 speakers who will break down the relationships between financial regulators, climate change, your retirement savings, and their impacts on Indigenous rights. First, we will be hearing from Jessica Garcia, who is a climate finance regulatory policy analyst at Americans for Financial Reform Education Fund, for an explanation and overview on the federal financial regulatory agency, the Securities and Exchange Commission, and their proposed rule on climate disclosure. Most recently, Jessica was an energy policy consultant for the Union of Concerned Scientists, also known as UCS, where she researched various clean energy technologies and authored a few resources to create UCS's Energy Storage Hub, which aims to help advocates and decision makers develop policies for the equitable deployment of energy storage to the benefit of climate and communities. Jessica holds a Master's of Public Policy degree from Duke University. From there, we will hear from Erica T. Patterson, who is a campaign director for the Action Center on Race and the Economy's Climate and Environmental Justice Program. Erica will share new findings from ACRE's latest report on Vanguard and how it pertains to the SEC's proposed rule on climate disclosure and how it's tied to your retirement savings. Erica brings years of corporate campaigning experience to her role, including leading a community labor coalition to winning the first community benefits agreement and union agreement with a multinational electric vehicle bus manufacturer. She also ran state and local advocacy campaigns to demand local transit agencies swap their fossil-fueled powered fleets for clean vehicles and to create pathways into good union jobs, building these buses for Black, Indigenous, and people of color communities, unhoused people, and people returning home from the carceral system. Lastly, we will hear from...
So sorry to interrupt. If you could just take a breath, like after each sentence in those dense biographies. Thank you so much.
Yes, of course. Lastly, we will hear from Moira Burse, who is the Climate and Finance Director at Amazon Watch, who will thread the needle into how this directly impacts Indigenous rights. Moira brings years of environmental and human rights advocacy and field experience to her work at Amazon Watch, while examining the financial industry's role in climate change, deforestation, and Indigenous rights abuses. She has co-founded and led initiatives urging firms and policymakers to address the role of investment capital in climate change and to incorporate an understanding of how climate change intersects with biodiversity protection and respect for Indigenous people's rights. After we hear remarks from our esteemed speakers, Aki of Positive Money US will walk us through an online action that we can take together. Should we have enough time, we will take a few questions before closing out today's session. With that, I'd like to turn it over to our first speaker, Jessica Garcia.
Hello, thank you, Munyang, and welcome all. I'm going to give an overview of the Securities and Exchange Commission, as well as climate financial regulation. Then talk a bit about the proposed climate disclosure rule, which is open to public comment until Friday, June 17th. US federal financial regulators are independent agencies responsible for overseeing or regulating the US financial system. The main bodies of the US financial system are financial institutions like banks and financial markets like stock exchanges, though many agencies cover financial oversight in addition to their primary missions. For banking, there are a few agencies, including the Federal Reserve Board, which is known as the Fed. There's the Office of the Comptroller of the Currency and the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation. You've probably been hearing a lot about the Fed in the news lately because they are responsible for monetary policy in the US and interest rates, which have been concerning folks because of inflation. For markets, sometimes called capital markets, you have the Securities and Exchange Commission, which is the focus for today's conversation, and the Commodity Futures Trading Commission. Some of the additional financial regulators include the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, the National Credit Union Administration, the Federal Housing Finance Agency, and many more. I want to also note that there are state-level bank, insurance, and securities regulators as well, but we will not get into that further at this time. So what is climate financial regulation? Financial regulation is a huge area of work, but for the purpose of this discussion, we want to talk more specifically about how climate ties in. Climate financial regulation is when regulators integrate the risks posed by climate change into their supervision of banks, insurance companies, and other financially regulated institutions or corporations. There are many ways this can be done by various agencies. Today, we'll focus on the potential role of the Securities and Exchange Commission. So, the Securities and Exchange Commission, referred to as the SEC or sometimes the Commission, is headed by 5 commissioners who are appointed by the president, one of whom is designated as the chair. The current SEC chair is Gary Gensler. The Securities and Exchange Commission, the SEC, has a mandate to protect investors, maintain fair, orderly, and efficient markets, and facilitate capital formation. Now, the SEC does this by overseeing companies, primarily publicly traded companies, though they do have some oversight over private companies as well, but in a more limited capacity. And they oversee these companies to prevent fraud, including market manipulation. The SEC also meets its mission or mandate by giving investors the information they need to make decisions through mandated disclosures. Now, I mentioned the SEC's new climate disclosure rule, but let me take a step back to explain the process. So what is a proposed rule? It's an official document that announces and explains an agency or regulator's plan to address a problem or accomplish a goal. A proposed rule comes from government agencies, executive branch or independent agency, and does not need to be voted on by Congress. Once posted, a proposed rule has a public comment period to request input, data, case studies, and more from all stakeholders. So after the comment period closes, the agency considers all the comments that have been submitted. These are considered comments in the record in its writing of a final rule. A final rule, which is sometimes called a federal administrative regulation, creates legally enforceable requirements. And that final rule will get published in the Federal Register with a date that it goes into effect. Now, bringing us back to the focus of today's conversation, why is this proposed climate disclosure rule needed, and why is the SEC, the Securities and Exchange Commission, proposing it? One of the reasons is that the current practice of relying on companies' voluntary climate disclosures is inconsistent, it's inefficient, and it's costly. And those costs are sometimes borne by the companies themselves in trying to meet a variety of voluntary standards, and those costs are incurred by investors who want to seek information. So investors spend significant time and money on shareholder voting initiatives to fill information gaps or on verifying the information they can currently access. So smaller investors, especially, lack resources to access reliable information on climate risks. I mentioned that it is part of the SEC's mission to protect investors, but the SEC doesn't only care about investors. They also think about other market participants. Now, saying that, their main filter for decision-making is still mostly investor needs and demands. The good news is that investors are demanding more information be disclosed from corporations on climate impacts. In fact, according to a poll recently conducted by Embold Research on behalf of my organization, Americans for Financial Reform, as well as Public Citizen, 70% of US retail investors agree that the Securities and Exchange Commission should require public companies to disclose standardized information about their climate-related financial risks. It's possible that you might be an investor. The SEC, the Securities and Exchange Commission, considers you a retail investor, meaning you're not an institutional investor, which is a company or an organization that invests money on behalf of other people. So you're a retail investor if you have retirement plans or personal investments. So that may include 401k, pensions, Roth IRAs, stocks, bonds, or a 529 savings plan. So what is the SEC asking for from companies with the current climate disclosure proposed rule? Corporations will be required to disclose climate-related financial risks and risk management strategies. Corporations will be required to disclose greenhouse gas emissions. So scope one, which are direct emissions, which come from day-to-day business operations of a company. They will be required to disclose scope 2, which is the use of purchased electricity by a company. And though currently proposed, scope 3 greenhouse gas emissions are not mandated across the board. They would only need to be disclosed by corporations if the corporation has set a public target that includes scope 3 emissions, or if a corporation decides that scope 3 emissions are material, meaning they think the emissions are significant enough for investors to alter their investment decisions based on that information. This materiality can be pretty subjective from corporations. So scope 3 emissions are everything else. They're emissions throughout a company's value chain. For example, scope 3 emissions might be pollution from your vehicle's tailpipe, which would be considered the scope 3 emissions for oil and gas companies. Finally, corporations in this proposal, based on this proposal, would be required to disclose detailed information about their climate targets, goals, and transition plans if they have already publicly committed to any of those. This proposed climate disclosure rule is thoughtful and detailed in a way that is going to provide us, advocates, a lot of data and information that can be used in future campaigns. We are generally supportive of this proposal. There are some areas in our comments to the Securities and Exchange Commission that we will highlight as needing strengthening, including asking for mandatory scope 3 disclosures for all companies and inclusion of disclosure of corporate impacts related to environmental injustices, Indigenous rights, and community level impacts. Toward the end of this webinar, we'll be asking you all to sign our petition for this proposed rule, and I encourage you to participate. I'm going to go ahead and pass now to my colleague, Erica, who is going to talk to you about Vanguard.
Thank you so much for that great overview, Jess. Super grateful to be here with friends from AFR and Public Citizen, and grateful to you all for leading up this work and rallying us around this critical rulemaking process. So hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us tonight. It's a pleasure to share the mic with Moira and Jess and Moon Young today. I would just like to start off by saying that it is really a huge first step for the SEC to issue this proposed rule that Jess just walked us through. And as she shared, the more disclosure that we get from this rule, the more that investors like you and me, people with pensions, 401ks, college savings plans, the more that we will know about the risks of how our money is being used. However, I think that it's really important to call out that while this proposed rule is a big step for the SEC, in this massive 500-page rule, there's zero mention and zero requirement for companies to disclose their environmental justice issues and community impacts, even though we know that the fossil fuel industry has disproportionately polluted and harmed Black, Brown, and Indigenous communities for decades and continues to do so. This is a huge omission and is really part of a larger pattern of the federal government failing to hold corporate polluters and their financiers accountable for harming poor communities and communities of color. And that is why we all need to throw down on this wonky rulemaking process. It's on us to make clear to the SEC that investors care about this, and that we want to know if our retirement is being invested into a new tar sands oil pipeline that's violating Indigenous rights, or financing a new waste incinerator in a majority Black community. We have a right to know about how these investments will not only expose our finances to risks, but also how the investments in these projects are exposing communities and our planet to serious risks. Next slide. So today, I just want to give you all a sense of just how badly the current SEC disclosures rules are failing investors and frontline communities. I'm sorry, if we go back one slide. I'm hoping to help illustrate why it's so critical that we come together to demand stronger climate risk disclosures, as well as disclosures around environmental injustices and community impacts, both for this rule and for the anticipated SEC ESG proposed rule. All we need to do is look at one Wall Street behemoth that's really taking advantage of the voluntary, non-standardized reporting requirements. And I'm here to talk to you about the second largest asset manager in the world, which is Pennsylvania-based Vanguard. Some of you may be familiar with Vanguard because they may manage your 401k or your pension plan. And many of you, like me a few years ago, may not be familiar with Vanguard at all, but are probably familiar with one of the 10,000 corporations that Vanguard has ownership stakes in. Last month, I learned a lot more about Vanguard than I ever thought I'd know, because Acre and our friends at Little Sis released a report called Vanguard's Empty Promises: How Vanguard Funds Harm and Fuels Extractive Industry. For those of you who haven't had a chance to check it out yet, our report really zooms in to Vanguard's so-called environmental, social, and governance funds. I saw a question earlier in the chat about whether ESGs are making a difference. And what we found is that in Vanguard's so-called ESG funds, they're actually investing billions of dollars in hundreds of polluting and carceral corporations that are exacerbating climate chaos and perpetuating violence, harassment, and environmental injustices in poor communities and Black, Brown, and Indigenous communities across the US. Our report also calls out how Vanguard's donor-advised funds have propped up climate change denying groups and right-wing groups fueling bigotry. But we're just going to look, but just looking at Vanguard's ESG funds alone, a fund that is really supposed to, in their words, on their own website, it's a fund that's supposed to reflect what matters most to us as investors. Looking at this, we see a clear example of why we can't trust these companies to self-regulate and why we need the SEC to set the terms. So looking at this slide, diving right into the findings, here is a snapshot of what our team uncovered in Vanguard's ESG fund. Here you can see how Vanguard's ESG fund actually holds billions of dollars in investments in sectors that pose high risks for poor and BIPOC communities. And when we say risks to poor and BIPOC communities, what we mean are adverse long-term health consequences from pollutants, hyper-surveillance from carceral industries, and deadly encounters with police via policing technology. You'll see that our team specifically analyzed two of Vanguard's US-based ESG funds, which is the US stock exchange traded funds, their ESGV, and their FTSE Social Index Fund. And what we found in these two funds is that Vanguard holds harmful, high-risk investments equal to at least $6 billion of the total $18.6 billion. This is equal to 32%, so over a third of overall holdings of Vanguard's US ESG funds are in high-risk sectors. And what's even more troubling is this is likely a conservative number. We researched only a sample of the holdings, meaning we didn't look at every single one of the hundreds of corporations that these funds invest in. These numbers that you're looking at show the evidence that we found of carceral corporations, dirty dollars, and polluting sectors within the studied funds. So now over the next few slides, I'll break down each of these categories. So our team defined dirty dollars as the financial institutions like the banks, asset managers, private equity firms, and insurance companies that are propping up and financing extractive industries. Some examples that you might be familiar with include Citibank, BlackRock, and AIG. These are some of the largest financiers and insurers of the fossil fuel industry, as well as the prison industry. Vanguard's US ESG equity funds hold at least $1.3 billion in sectors with what we're calling dirty dollars. Next slide, please. The polluter category is pretty straightforward. These are the fossil fuel corporations and other large corporations whose direct lines of business have a harmful impact on the environment and surrounding communities. Examples of corporations that we found in these funds include Dow, which is a chemicals corporation that produced napalm and was dumped on communities throughout Vietnam during the war, and still is committing all kinds of environmental injustices to this day. Newmont, a globally harmful mining corporation. PPL, which is a coal-fired utility, and Covanta, which is a waste incineration corporation that's been polluting a predominantly Black community in Pennsylvania and poisoning the air in other frontline communities and communities of color. Vanguard's US ESG equity funds hold at least $1.4 billion in sectors with polluters. Next slide. Carceral corporations are corporations whose direct lines of business rely on the prison system or policing of BIPOC communities like private prisons, weapons production, and surveillance technologies. One investment example that you might be familiar with is Axon, which is a defense company that produces tasers for police departments. These funds also invest in corporations that profit from surveillance technology and have contracts with police departments and prison institutions such as Microsoft, Amazon, and Motorola Solutions. Vanguard's US ESG equity funds hold at least $3.3 billion in sectors that have carceral corporations. Next slide, please. So that's just a very quick snapshot of the key findings from our research team. Like I mentioned earlier, our report also dug into Vanguard's donor-advised funds and found that the company has channeled millions of dollars to climate change denying groups and right-wing groups fueling bigotry. But I won't go into detail on those findings today, just for the sake of time. but I hope that the overview that I gave you helps make clear some of the glaring ways that the current SEC disclosure rules are really failing values-based investors and frontline communities. Vanguard's ESG fund is a microcosm of the wild, wild west of self-reporting and self-defined disclosures. They straight up just don't work for investors, for frontline communities, or for the planet. And the current practice of relying on companies' voluntary climate disclosures is not only inconsistent, but it is confusing and costly to all of us. Extractive corporations like the ones that I named and their financiers should be required to disclose how they've contributed to environmental, climate, and racial injustice in the past, as well as in the present, as well as their efforts and strategies that they need to deploy to redress decades of harm. The SEC needs to also deliver on its mission and mandate to protect investors like you and me by giving us the info that we need to make decisions via mandated disclosures. With stronger mandated disclosures, we can better hold corporations like Vanguard and other financial institutions accountable to their climate commitments. We can better demand that they stop investing in corporations that are fueling violence and environmental injustices in frontline BIPOC communities. And we can have a better sense of the real risks that these investments are posing to our financial futures. You know, to manage expectations, we may not, and we likely will not get all of the language that we want into this rule. And the industry is very powerful and already has a very organized oppositional campaign that they're running. But that is all the more reason why we all need to engage on this rule so that the SEC knows that there are many more risks and many more stakeholders that they need to consider. So later on in the program, you all can help make our demands on the SEC more powerful by taking action today, which Moon Young will share about later. But for now, I'm going to pass it to my friend Moira to walk you through some other important findings. Thank you all.
Thanks so much, Erica. And thanks to everyone for being here. So I'm going to dig in to one area of risk that so far, unfortunately, the SEC is largely ignoring, which is creating big risks for investors, but I would argue as importantly for communities and for our planet. First slide, please. Next slide. So what we've been seeing is that while more and more companies and investors are starting to make public commitments related to environmental protection and climate change, these commitments and the disclosures that companies are making about them still largely ignore the rights of communities that might be negatively impacted by company activities. Next slide. So as climate change worsens and concern both amongst corporations as well as investors and of course the general public grows about the need to protect the environment and biodiversity, the risks from these conflicts with communities that want to protect those things will only deepen, especially with communities like Indigenous communities that maintain close relationship with the natural world. Next slide. And what research that I've done at Amazon Watch and colleagues and allies elsewhere has shown that corporate lack of respect for the rights of communities and especially Indigenous and tribal peoples who have internationally recognized rights to self-determination. The lack of corporate respect for these rights can create all kinds of legal, political, reputational, and operational risks for companies, and therefore for investors in those companies. And so investors and other market participants need to know about these risks, and the SEC should require them to provide that information. And I want to give an example of a case that I work on. to illustrate why I'm making this argument. So there's a company called Geopark, an oil company, that decided to invest in an oil field in the Peruvian Amazon and bought a license to do so in 2014. However, the oil block, as it's called in Peru, they're called blocks, already had a long history of successful indigenous resistance to oil companies. Just 2 years prior to Geopark's lease purchase, local communities, the Achuar and One Piece people, had kicked out Talisman Energy in 2012. And as soon as it was announced that Geopark had purchased the lease, the Achuar and One Piece people expressed strong and staunch opposition. Just a few examples of what they did. The Achuar Federation filed a lawsuit with the Peruvian Constitutional Court for lack of prior consultation. Communities, both publicly in the press and through official channels, challenged Geopark's environmental impact study, so much so that the company had to withdraw that study and supposedly to do a new one. Communities confronted the CEO of Geopark at the 2019 annual meeting of shareholders. And in early 2020, the One Piece Nation filed a criminal complaint against Geopark due to the risk that the One Piece Nation peoples faced from the continued presence of company workers during the onset of the COVID-19 pandemic. And in the face of all this community opposition, which of course was announced even before Geopark purchased the lease, Geopark decided to leave and cut ties with the block and sold its rights there in July of 2020. And some research that we did into how much money Geopark lost shows that the company lost at least $78 million of investment into operations in that block. And that block had, while it was still under Geopark's control, had accounted for 20% of the company's net proved reserves, meaning 20% of its projected revenue was in this place where it had been clear from the beginning that indigenous peoples were opposed to drilling there. Next slide. So this is just one example of how companies rarely adequately account for the risks arising from conflicts with impacted communities, let alone disclose information about these risks to investors. And this is despite the fact that these companies are making climate commitments and local communities, especially indigenous and tribal peoples, are regularly proven to be critical to the protection of forests and other ecosystems that are critical to climate stability. Next slide. It's also despite the fact that indigenous and tribal peoples have, I think we have a little typo here, but an additional set of rights above and beyond the human rights that all of us enjoy, that creates additional duties for corporate actors. And despite the fact that, as I laid out in the Geopark example, the opposition of impacted communities to corporate activities on their territories regularly leads to delays, to cost overruns, to legal battles, and, as the Geopark case illustrates, project cancellations. Next slide. So this lack of attention to these risks and the lack of disclosure about these risks resulting from this corporate lack of respect for rights means that not only is this a major harm to the communities without a doubt, but it is also currently hurting investors and of course the planet. Next slide. So next slide, please. We argue that the SEC has a crucial opportunity now to ensure that investors and other market participants, and that includes impacted communities, have the necessary information to make truly informed decisions. And just a couple quick examples of what that could look like and to help you understand how this could be useful for investors and for advocates and communities themselves. Businesses should disclose how their business model implicates the issues of Indigenous or tribal people's rights throughout their supply chains, right? And contractors and subcontractors. Next slide. They should be publicly disclosing the names of the Indigenous or tribal peoples whose territories are impacted by operations. And it's really important to note that should include both legally recognized tribes and Indigenous nations, but also those who haven't necessarily been recognized by the state, because of course, here in the US and in many other countries, the governments have not been very good about recognizing Native peoples with legal recognition. Another example is that any and all land grievances or complaints filed by local communities in the company's area of operations, how the company has responded, and what those who've made the complaints say about the response from the company, right? These are essential things that it's imperative for communities to understand, but very much so investors as well. And so that's why we're calling on the SEC to include these kinds of disclosures, whether it's in this climate-related risk disclosure process or in forthcoming rulemaking processes that the SEC is embarking on. That is all I have. And so I'm going to pass it on now to Aki, who's going to help us take some collective action.
Thank you so much, Moira, and thank you to all our wonderful speakers. I've learned a lot tonight. Now it's time to make our voices heard on the SEC's proposed rule on climate disclosures. I know that I definitely want more information about the climate risk that my investments have, as well as whether I'm investing in companies that have credible plans to phase out their emissions. And I imagine that everyone here wants those things too. So let's tell the SEC that we support its proposed rule and that it should be made even stronger. Click on the link in the chat to join the petition that we are sending. You are going to be one of over 50,000 people that adds a comment in support of the rule. Austin is sharing their screen so we can all see what the petition looks like. All you have to do is add your name, your email, and zip code. They will also translate the page to show the petition text in Spanish, and we are adding a Spanish language translation of the petition to the chat. So thank you all for taking this action. We're going to wait a few minutes so that you can all send this message to the SEC. And in the meantime, please put any questions you have in the chat in English or in Spanish, and also throw in your favorite emoji or just put done in the chat when you're finished taking this action. Loving all the energy in the chat. Thank you so much, everyone. I'm seeing all of these actions being taken, and it's giving me a lot of energy. So I appreciate you all being here and doing this with us.
Thank you so much, Aki, and thank you so much to everyone who has taken action with us today. It looks like we have time for one question before we close today's session. I want to uplift the question from Julie. The question is, Chevron has done so much environmental damage to the Amazon. As the Amazon is cleared for oil extraction, the whole world suffers since the Amazon is considered the lungs of the earth. As long as Bolsonaro remains the president of Brazil, how can this extraction be stopped since he supports extraction? Bolsonaro and Chevron never seem to be held accountable. Moira, if you'd like to chime in.
Sure, I figured that would be directed at me. Yeah, thanks so much for that question. And thanks for the recognition about how important the Amazon is to climate stability, to biodiversity, and of course, to the indigenous peoples who call it home. Yeah, you know, actually that question gets very much directly to why going after financial actors and holding them accountable is so important, because we might have places like Brazil where the president is eager to cut down the Amazon and to destroy the territories and the lives of indigenous peoples there. But we also know from research that Amazon Watch has done and other organizations have done that many of the biggest investors in the companies responsible for that deforestation and for those rights abuses are US-based financial firms like BlackRock, like JP Morgan Chase, like Vanguard, and others. And so if we can, through financial regulation, we can get more information about those investments through campaigning and public pressure, we can push them to change their investment practices, then that's going to go a really long way in places like the Amazon. So great question. Thank you so much. And I'll drop a link too in the chat to some research we've done on this.
Great. Thank you so much, Moira. So with that, I would like to close today's session. I want to thank everyone who has joined today's call, everyone from our speakers to our language justice team, and everyone who has taken action on today's event. Please be on the lookout for the final Stop the Money Pipeline training on climate financial regulation soon. The last topic will be the Community Reinvestment Act. Thank you so much, and we wish you a wonderful evening.